When we think about what governments accumulated their debts doing in the 20th and 19th century, for the most part, it was very, very different than what they accumulated their prior debts doing. In fact, historically speaking, most countries ran up their national debts by fighting wars. If we take a look at the history of England, for instance, between 1130 and 1815, roughly 75% of England's total revenues were spent supporting its army and navy. Now, today, most of the indebted countries in the world, the most heavily indebted countries in the world, have accumulated most of their debts from social programming, effectively the redistribution of wealth from one group of citizens to another. The main reason that this has been problematic as a redistribution is because more money has been spent than has been paid in by people. And it's important to understand how this came to be, because the people who set up these programs weren't stupid. And they didn't set them up intentionally for failure. While there may have been some angle of politicking, of promising benefits that a future administration would be required to find a way to deliver, a lot of this had to do with people's expectations of what the world would look like in the future. And unfortunately, things changed a lot more quickly in the 20th century than people had necessarily anticipated. Now, when we look at social programming, most of the early social programs run by states were targeted towards poverty relief. But once we get into the early part of the 20th century with world wars and the Great Depression, we see that states tend to start evolving the protection that they offer. Instead of being just towards the poor as a form of charity, they instead begin to move towards protecting all of their citizens from a variety of different economic shocks. And it's interesting to see this transition. Beginning with a state that is sort of treating its people as subjects to a monarch or subjects to a sovereign, and then by shifting towards one where the interests of its citizens are the interests of the state. So this is an important transition. In the 1700s, most rulers cared about their people to the extent that they needed the supplication of their people in order to, say, pay taxes or get them to donate corvée labor to large-scale projects, or to serve in wars, to protect the nation, or perhaps plunder other regions. But now things are dramatically different. In the 20th century, we found that most of our spending has been on social welfare programs, spending money on things like public education, healthcare, and other kinds of issues, for instance, elderly pensions and workers' protection. That provides us with a richer society, you might say, one in which individuals don't necessarily have to worry about which bolt of lightning will ruin them economically speaking. One of the challenges we have with the modern welfare state is that it wasn't properly designed. And in the 21st century, some of these challenges are finally coming home to roost. Now, the modern welfare state, as we know it, was developed in Germany, basically, as a form of placating members of the public who were otherwise getting up and leaving Imperial Germany for the relatively free or ultra-cheap land that was available to Americans who were willing to break pasture land and begin farming in the Midwest, which had recently been taken from the indigenous people who had lived there. So, worried that Germany would be unable to field the kinds of armies it had in the 1860s and 70s when it had achieved its imperial position, Bismarck, the chancellor, decided to introduce a number of social programs to make it worth staying in Germany, effectively keep the Germans in Germany so they can be soldiers, as opposed to losing them to America where they would become farmers. So Bismarck's social programs were relatively wide-based. We see the beginning of them showing up in 1883, where there's a basic insurance policy put out for people who are ill and cannot work. There's an accident insurance that's supplied for workers starting in 1884, and a general old age pension for anyone of sufficient age in society starting in 1889. Now, all of these programs were funded on what we call a pay-as-you-go basis that you may have encountered in the earlier discussions of our pension system, which means that governments are collecting premiums and effectively acting as an insurer. They collect taxes and they meet the obligations with those taxes. And if taxes are ever insufficient to meet those obligations, they borrow on an ad hoc basis. Now, this was an easy situation to manage at first when the scope of benefits was relatively small. In the original German pension, It was estimated that in Bismarck's Germany, less than 3% of people lived long enough to collect any pension, and those that did were generally dead within 18 months. So it was relatively basic for a larger worker body who definitely outnumbered the retirees who weren't going to survive very long to simply shoulder the burden. So there wasn't very expensive at first to be able to provide these sorts of benefits because few people were drawing them and many people were contributing to the financing of them. Now, recognizing how successful Germany's programs had been in keeping the Germans in Germany, England decided to introduce similar programs as well, fearing that a large number of their people might simply pack up and move to other nations in the Americas, for instance, in a similar sort of pattern. So England introduces a basic pension in 1908, introduces national health insurance in 1911, and finally an unemployment insurance scheme that covers almost all workers beginning in 1920. Interestingly enough, the leaders in both Germany and England at the time were very clear to announce that these types of policies were sure to win any sort of election. So it was recognized that even though these might be valuable social programs, when they were first introduced, people knew that they were vote getters. People understood that they were promising benefits to people, and there was less concern about problems that might emerge in the future resulting from these promises to deal with immediate challenges of society. Now, a really significant expansion of the welfare state occurs in the 1930s under Imperial Japan. Imperial Japan has found itself in a challenging situation of not having any of the geography necessary for its autarkic civilization to flourish properly, and so it finds itself going abroad and attempting to conquer and plunder others for the resources it feels that it needs. Now, of course, this inevitably moves away from simply being a soldier mobilization to being a mass mobilization of society, because Japan, being a relatively small country compared to the nations it was invading on the mainland, it didn't have the population necessarily to be able to walk in and impose order over a far more populous region, like, say, the mainland of Imperial China or Republican China, I suppose, at the time. So in the 1930s, Japan massively expanded its welfare state under the premise that all citizens were soldiers and all people should have insurance. This eventually turns into all people should have pensions. The idea being that if people are supporting the state would provide effectively a warrior's pension to anyone at all who was willing to help the state, even if that meant staying home and working in factories or raising children. So what we saw was that the modern welfare state of the state getting behind its people is actually part of a bargain. It's a political bargain between the powers that administer the state and the citizens who are supplying the resources necessarily that the state runs on. Now, if we move on to talking specifically about Canada's social safety net, you'll be able to see very quickly where some of our problems begin to emerge. Our worker programs began around the same time as Britain's in the early 20th century. We had a modest workers' compensation insurance that developed in 1914. There was a mother's allowance to support fertility in 1916. An old age pension begins to roll out in 1927. But again, all of these benefits are remarkably modest. And they don't do very much to shield Canadians from the challenges of the Great Depression during the 1920s and 30s. In fact, during the mid-1930s, R.B. Bennett proposed a New Deal in Canada that would expand these benefits dramatically, but he lost the election. And unfortunately, his proposals were ruled to be unconstitutional by the Canadian Supreme Court. So even though there was a drive to enhance the social safety net, it would take, in fact, an entire generation before the political will could properly be mustered in Canada. And the main source of this political will was not the notion of helping out poor people. It followed on the path of Japan's all citizens are soldiers. By the time we clear World War II, Canada's contributions to the wars had been so significant that there was felt that the state had to find a way to give back. Much like the Americans had done with the GI Bill, post-World War II, the Canadian state invested heavily into creating effectively a great society that would be worthy of the sacrifices that their soldiers had made. So that meant investing in things like public hospitals and post-secondary education. We created things like a national unemployment insurance program starting in 1956 We see Tommy Douglas helping to push through the creation of our national healthcare programs in the late 1950s and early mid 1960s as well. 1965 sees the creation of the much more muscular Canada Pension Plan, supplemented with the old age security that was discussed during the lectures on our pension system. In Ontario, we took things even further, creating programs like social housing in the mid-1960s, a welfare program later called Ontario Works in 1966, and even financing for students seeking post-secondary education in the form of the Ontario Student Assistance Program, or the ubiquitous OSAP. Now, the rather generous benefits that were lined up as a result of this in the 1960s ultimately were predicated on the notion that we would have continued high birth rates. If we take a look at the graph at the top of this slide, you'll notice that most families in the early 20th century were having about 4 children each. And we almost reached that point again in the early 1960s. So people at the time felt that this was a bit of an anomalous decline here in the early part of the 20th century, that the Depression had really led to a lot fewer children, but that post-Depression, the world would be better off. Now, you can see here that at the time when these programs are getting created in the 1960s, fertility is relatively high, and people are anticipating that there will be large future generations of workers who will be able to support these programs. It didn't happen that way. As you can see, fertility drops off very, very quickly starting in the 1970s. And this means that the original math of these social programs, very much like Bismarck's, where you had many workers or many current contributors working to support a handful of beneficiaries. By the time we get to the 21st century, things have really, really changed in Canada, and they're going to require us perhaps to rethink how it is that we finance some of this society that we've all come to enjoy.